Farther downstream, in the middle of the river, Velutha floated on his back, looking up at the stars. His paralyzed brother and his one-eyed father had eaten the dinner he had cooked them and were asleep. So he was free to lie in the river and drift slowly with the current. A log, a serene crocodile. Coconut trees bent into the river and watched him float by. Yellow bamboo wept. Small fish took coquettish liberties with him, pecked him. He flipped over and began to swim, upstream, against the current. He turned towards the bank for one last look, treading water, feeling foolish for having been so sure, so certain. When he saw her, the detonation almost drowned him. It took all his strength to stay afloat. He trod water, standing in the middle of the dark river. She didn't see the knob of his head bobbing over the dark river. He could have been anything, a floating coconut. In any case, she wasn't looking. Her head was buried in her arms. He watched her. He took his time. Had he known that he was about to enter a tunnel whose only egress was his own annihilation, would he have turned away? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Who can tell? He began to swim towards her, quietly, cutting through the water with no fuss. He had almost reached the bank when she looked up and saw him. His feet touched the muddy riverbed. As he rose from the dark river and walked up the stone steps, she saw that the world they stood in was his, that he belonged to it, that it belonged to him. The water, the mud, the trees, the fish, the stars. He moved so easily through it. As she watched him, she understood the quality of his beauty, how his labor had shaped him, how the wood he fashioned had fashioned him. Each plank he planed, each nail he drove, each thing he made had molded him, had left its stamp on him, had given him his strength, his supple grace. He wore a thin white cloth around his loins, looped between his dark legs. He shook the water from his hair. She could see his smile in the dark, his white, sudden smile that he had carried with him from boyhood into manhood, his only luggage. They looked at each other. They weren't thinking anymore. The time for that had come and gone. Smashed smiles lay ahead of them. But that would be later. Later. He stood before her with the river dripping from him. She stayed sitting on the steps watching him. Her face pale in the moonlight, a sudden chill crept over him. His heart hammered. It was all a terrible mistake. He had misunderstood her. The whole thing was a figment of his imagination. This was a trap. There were people in the bushes watching. She was the delectable bait. How could it be otherwise? They had seen him in the march. He tried to make his voice casual, normal. It came out in a croak. "Amakuti, what is it?" She went to him and laid the length of her body against his. He just stood there. He didn't touch her. He was shivering, partly with cold, partly terror. Partly aching desire. Despite his fear, his body was prepared to take the bait. It wanted her, urgently. His wetness wet her. She put her arms around him. He tried to be rational. What's the worst thing that can happen? I could lose everything. My job, my family, my livelihood, everything. She could hear the wild hammering of his heart. She held him till it calmed down somewhat. She unbuttoned her shirt. They stood there skin to skin. Her brownness against his blackness, her softness against his hardness, her nut-brown breast that wouldn't support a toothbrush against his smooth ebony chest. She smelled the river on him, his particular paraffin smell that so disgusted baby Kokoma. Ammu put out her tongue and tasted it in the hollow of his throat, on the lobe of his ear. She pulled his head down toward her and kissed his mouth, a cloudy kiss, a kiss that demanded a kiss back. He kissed her back. First cautiously, then urgently. Slowly his arms came up behind her. He stroked her back, very gently. She could feel the skin on his palms, rough, calloused, sandpaper. He was careful not to hurt her. She could feel how soft she felt to him. She could feel herself through him, her skin, the way her body existed only where he touched her. The rest of her was smoke. She felt him shudder against her. His hands were on her haunches, that could support a whole array of toothbrushes, pulling her hips against his to let her know how much he wanted her. Biology designed the dance. Terror timed it, dictated the rhythm with which their bodies answered each other, as though they knew already that for each tremor of pleasure they would pay an equal measure of pain, as though they knew that how far they went would be measured against how far they would be taken. So they held back, tormented against each other, gave of each other slowly, but that only made it worse. It only raised the stakes. It only cost them more. because it smoothed the wrinkles, the fumble and rush of unfamiliar love, and roused them to fever pitch. Behind them the river pulsed through the darkness, shimmering like wild silk. Yellow bamboo wept. Knight's elbows rested on the water and watched them. They lay under the mangosteen tree, where only recently a great old boat plant with boat flowers and boat fruit had been uprooted by a mobile republic. A wasp, a flag, a surprised puff, a fountain and a love in Tokyo. The scurrying, hurrying boat world was already gone. The white termites on their way to work, the white ladybirds on their way home, the white beetles burrowing away for the light, the white grasshoppers with whitewood violins, the sad white music, all gone, leaving a boat-shaped patch of bare dry earth, cleared and ready for love, as though East Happen and Rahel had prepared the ground for them, willed this to happen, the twin midwives of Ammu's dream. Ammu, naked now, crouched over Velutha, her mouth on his. He drew her hair around them like a tent, like her children did when they wanted to exclude the outside world. She slid further down, introducing herself to the rest of him, his neck, his nipples, his chocolate stomach. She sipped the last of the river from the hollow of his navel. She pressed the heat of his erection against her eyelids. She tasted him, salty in her mouth. She sat up and drew her back to him. She felt his belly tighten under her, hard as a board. She felt her wetness slipping on his skin. He took her nipple in his mouth and cradled her other breast in his callous palm, velvet gloved in sandpaper. At the moment that she guided him into her, she caught a passing glimpse of his youth, his youngness, the wonder in his eyes at the secret he had unearthed, and she smiled down at him as though he was her child. Once he was inside her, fear was derailed and biology took over. The cost of living climbed to unaffordable heights, though later baby Kokama would say it was a small price to pay. Was it? 2 lives, 2 children's childhoods, and a history lesson for future offenders. Clouded eyes held clouded eyes in a steady gaze, and a luminous woman opened herself to a luminous man. She was as wide and deep as a river in spate. He sailed on her waters. She could feel him moving deeper and deeper into her, frantic, frenzied, asking to be led in further, further, stopped only by the shape of her, the shape of him. And when he was refused, when he had touched the deepest depths of her, with a sobbing, shuddering sigh, he drowned. She lay against him, their bodies slick with sweat. She felt his body drop away from her, his breath become more regular. She saw his eyes clear. He stroked her hair, sensing that the knot that he had eased in him was still tight and quivering in her. Gently he turned her over on her back. He wiped the sweat and grit from her with his wet cloth. He lay over her, careful not to put his weight on her. Small stones pressed into the skin of her forearms. He kissed her eyes, her ears, her breasts, her belly, her 7 silver stretch marks from her twins, the line of down that led from her navel to her dark triangle, that told him where she wanted him to go, the inside of her legs, where her skin was softest. Then Carpenter's hands lifted her hips, and an untouchable tongue touched the innermost part of her, drank long and deep from the bowl of her. She danced for him. On that boat-shaped piece of earth, she lived. He held her against him, resting his back once again against the mangosteen tree, while she cried and laughed at once. Then, for what seemed like an eternity, but was really no more than 5 minutes, she slept leaning against him, her back against his chest. 7 years of oblivion lifted off her and flew into the shadows on weighty, quaking wings, like a dull steel peahen, and on Ammu's road to age and death, a small sunny meadow appeared, copper grass spangled with blue butterflies. Beyond it, an abyss. Slowly the terror seeped back into him, and what he had done, and what he knew he would do again, and again. She woke to the sound of his heart knocking against his chest, as though it was searching for a way out, for that movable rib, a secret sliding folding panel. His arms were still around her. She could feel the muscles move while his hands played with a dry palm frond. Ammu smiled to herself in the dark. Thinking how much she loved his arms, the shape and strength of them. How safe she felt resting in them when actually it was the most dangerous place she could be. He folded his fear into a perfect rose. He held it out in the palm of his hand. She took it from him and put it in her hair. She moved closer, wanting to be within him, to touch more of him. He gathered her into the cave of his body. A breeze lifted off the river and cooled their warm bodies. It was a little cold, a little wet, a little quiet, the air. But what was there to say? An hour later, Ammu disengaged herself gently. I have to go. He said nothing, didn't move. He watched her dress. Only one thing mattered now. They knew that it was all they could ask of each other. The only thing. Ever. They both knew that.